In the name of the most merciful, we begin this journey of divine light and sacred truth. They swept you aside as insignificant, a passing reference in their grand chronicle, someone to be dismissed with barely a flick of the wrist. You remained on the outskirts, the muted presence nobody bothered to include, too wary to append their carefully wrought pecking order. Little did they realize just how completely they'd misjudged you. You were quietly marshaling forces behind the scenes, preparing a storm that would soon uproot their self-styled throne, even as they performed their elaborate display of superiority. Every scornful glance, each derisive aside, every moment they spoke over you as though you didn't exist, all of it was being catalogued in your keen, unblinking mind. You weren't huddled in shadows, trembling. Far from it. You positioned yourself where their facade would crack, seizing every subtle cue they thought was hidden. Well before this tipping point, hints had surfaced, intuitive flashes that transcended mere logic. Whispers in your intuition were the beginning. Those times when you just knew things before they happened, when you could feel the undercurrents of dishonesty running behind nice exteriors. Your dreams turned into vibrant truth tapestries that revealed linkages and patterns that your conscious mind was still beginning to decipher. You started observing those instances that were too exact to be coincidental, too well-timed to be the result of chance. The way discussions would pause the moment you showed up, as though your very existence interrupted meticulously planned stories. The very human responses of those around you served as confirmation of what you were becoming, in addition to the otherworldly signs. With an intensity that seemed more akin to reconnaissance than interest, strangers started observing you. Even though the questions were disguised as light chat, you could sense that they were actually quite inquisitive. After years of ignoring you, people suddenly showed an unexplainable interest in your everyday activities, ideas, and plans. You could feel the change in the energy around you. The subtle tension that arises when people realize they're in the presence of someone who sees past the facade of their well-crafted identities is what used to happen when you passed through locations unnoticed. But now you sensed eyes monitoring your movements and conversations, changing when you entered rooms. Even though they had no idea what had changed, they could sense it in their bones, that rudimentary understanding that the dynamics had changed. It was your moderation, not your violence, that made your approach so beautiful. They were unable to comprehend what you understood. Genuine authority doesn't manifest itself through grandiose announcements and pomp. Finding every crevice, vulnerability, every weak spot in their facade, real authority moves like water and then waits. It observes. It prepares them for the time when their entire dam of lies will explode dramatically from a single drip of truth. From the start, you could see through their phony confidence, how their hands betrayed them with faint shakes when their authority was questioned, even subtly, and how their voices rose a little when they believed they were being challenged. With the accuracy of a skilled strategist researching enemy terrain, you took in every clue, uneasy habit, and compensatory behavior that appeared on their faces when they believed no one was examining their performance. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Luke 6 verse 38. Beloved, when you tap the Super Thanks button and sow a $20 seed today, you are aligning yourself with heaven's economy of overflow. If your heart is stirred for a greater harvest, elevate your offering to $50 and watch God press down, shake together, and pour out blessings beyond measure. And for those who believe in the promise of abundance, give more, and see your life break forth in every good thing, just as the Lord has pledged. But this is where your true brilliance came to light. You allow them to delve deeper rather than exposing them right away and pointing out their contradictions in real time. You saw them come up with complex explanations for their actions. You watched as they increased the number of lies they said, enlisted more people in their deceptive network, and constructed ever higher towers of deceit. The inevitable fall only became more destructive, comprehensive, and irrevocable with each succeeding level of its development. Though they were unable to fully explain the change, they started to sense something different about you. They felt uneasy for reasons they couldn't articulate, because of the new weight and density your silence held. There was a fundamental shift in your energy when they tried their typical dominance games, including the interruptions, dismissive gestures, and subtle put-downs. You had stopped shrinking. You didn't say you were sorry for taking up room. The mouse had changed. They were still acting on the risky presumption that you were harmless, even though they could feel the change. Even when they tried to antagonize you, you maintained your coolness. They were utterly disappointed by the calm imperviousness that greeted their attempts at manipulation. As you maintained your composure and grew more powerful in your restraint, they found themselves exerting more and more effort to obtain responses from you that never materialized, depleting their energy supplies. They were unaware that each unsuccessful attempt to break you merely added information to your developing knowledge of their mental terrain. You started to see the weakness that needed continual approval and obedience from others to keep its fragile structure intact, the desperation that lay beneath their bluster, and the insecurity that drove their drive to dominate. For them to feel big, they needed you to be tiny. They needed your devaluation to support their fictitious ascent. However, you had cut off their addiction, and withdrawal was becoming severe. This was something considerably more significant, something that had been woven into the very fabric of your existence long before you breathed your first breath in this lifetime, rather than an accident of circumstance or a chance change in your personality. You realized that you weren't merely blundering through this awakening. You had been brought here, selected for this particular time, this unique arrangement of souls, and this particular set of circumstances. The recognition sliced through the darkness like lightning. Their tidy categories were never intended for you. They were never made to go in the directions they were supposed to. You never meant to look for approval from systems that were inherently at odds with who you were. Your inadequacy was not demonstrated by the times they attempted to fit you into their boxes, when you felt like an outsider looking in, or when their world seemed unnatural and alien. They served as evidence of your genuine character. You stopped wondering why their games didn't appear to have any purpose for you, why their ideals didn't seem real, and why their ideas of success made you feel empty. Rather, you started to accept the reality that had been nagging at you the entire time. You were functioning on an entirely separate frequency that they were unable to access, comprehend, and most definitely not control. Yellow heart if you're moved by divine love. Now is the moment to share it. Click the Super Thanks button on YouTube and contribute $50 or more to help us broadcast God's blessings far and wide. Every act of generosity you make is being watched in heaven and will return to you 100-fold. Your long-term loneliness changed from being a burden to a blessing. Those times of isolation had served as preparation rather than punishment. You were cultivating something far more significant than others who were occupied with social chess, networking, and politics. An unbreakable bond with your own inner authority, a faith in your intuition that could not be shaken by outside influence. They had misinterpreted your inclination toward authenticity over popularity as a sign of weakness, your preference for deep connections over superficial ones as a sign of social incompetence, and your refusal to sacrifice your principles in order to gain favor as being unyielding. However, they were the precise attributes that made you untouchable, unmovable, and eventually unstoppable, not weaknesses in your character. The paranoia started off slowly, showing up as sidelong looks when they thought you weren't looking, discussions that quickly ended when you walked into a room, and a developing feeling that perhaps, just possibly, you had been paying more attention than they had ever thought. They began to relive previous exchanges, looking for clues they could have overlooked, and wondering what you had actually taken in during all those times they treated you like you were invisible. Your change wasn't abrupt or dramatic. It was tectonic and geological, with fundamental structures underfoot that were changing. You stopped trying to explain yourself to those who had already made up their minds what they wanted to think of you. While they continued to be blind to the earthquake that was brewing deep within. You stopped trying to prove your value to people who had made a significant financial investment in underestimating you. The riskiest thing for them is that you stop taking part in the complex dance of trying to get their approval, which leaves them without a partner for the performance that embodies their superiority complex. The real beauty of your strategy, however, came to light at this point. You didn't simply stop playing their games. Instead, you started using whole new rules that they couldn't even understand, much less understand. You were developing internal sovereignty while they were concentrating on outward displays of power. You were forming sincere relationships with people who shared your frequency, while they were creating networks of influence founded on manipulation and reciprocity. We began to identify your tribe, those exceptional people who knew that true strength comes from authenticity rather than artifice, who could tell the difference between someone wearing a mask and someone living their truth, and who didn't need to denigrate others in order to feel powerful. These were not the individuals moving up the traditional success ladders. It was they who were developing completely new conceptualizations of what success may entail. You were relieved to be totally recognized and welcomed for who you really were, not for who you could pretend to be, something you had hardly ever felt in mainstream settings. These bonds were created in the realization of a common essence, a sort of soul-level recognition that went beyond typical social dynamics, rather than on the basis of common interests or advantages. The disparity grew severe. You had been continuously acting, continuously changing, continuously attempting to translate your genuine self into languages that devalued rather than articulated who you really were in one world, their world. Communication was easy in this other world, the one where your true tribe lived, since it was founded on understanding rather than manipulation, on truth rather than strategy. Your change in social orientation was not overlooked. They started to realize that you were connecting with individuals they couldn't influence, getting energy from sources they couldn't access, and obtaining something they couldn't reach. The most dangerous aspect of all was probably your increasing independence from their system of approval and control, which showed that their influence was much more constrained than they had initially thought. There was a void left by your lack of desire for their approval, and it started to rip at the very fabric of their whole worldview. What power did they really have if you didn't need their consent to be who you were? If their views didn't influence how you saw yourself? If you didn't need their acceptance to be at peace? Their confidence was eroded by the acid of doubt as the questions started to eat away at them from the inside out. By raising the loudness of their dismissiveness, trying to irritate you more frequently, and enlisting others to join their campaign of devaluation, they tried to reclaim control. However, everyone who could see was simply made aware of the extent of their insecurity by these frantic actions. The more violently they assaulted your composure, the more it became clear that you had what they sorely lacked: true inner power that didn't need approval from others to remain strong. They made a crucial mistake as their desperation increased. They started researching you as thoroughly as you had been researching them, but they were unable to recognize the basic difference in your goals. Their observation was motivated by fear and jealousy, whereas yours had been motivated by strategic awareness and intelligence. They sought to figure out how to make you invincible, to reverse engineer your change, to somehow capture and duplicate it. They observed how you handled situations that would have caused them to lose their cool, pointing out your capacity to maintain composure in the face of pandemonium. They saw your ability to deflect their provocations without appearing to try, your ability to make their attempts at manipulation seem blatantly obvious and silly just by choosing not to respond. In an attempt to comprehend how you had drawn individuals with such actual substance, while their own interactions remained transactional and superficial, they examined your expanding network of true connections. What they failed to understand, though, is that authenticity cannot be produced. You can't fake inner tranquility. Furthermore, true power cannot be replicated. When they needed a total character shift, they were attempting to discover procedures. When a fundamental transformation in consciousness was needed, they were trying to master strategies. Their attempts to imitate your energy simply served to demonstrate their ignorance of what that energy was. Their attempts to mimic your composed manner came across as phony and forced. It felt more like manipulation than wisdom when they tried to imitate your planned silence. They seemed petty rather than enlightened when they imitated your refusal to participate in drama. It became increasingly clear that they were attempting to wear a costume that was never intended for them as they examined you more. Your memory was what gave you your strength, not something you had learned. It was who you had always been underneath the layers of training that had momentarily hidden your actual self. It wasn't a role you were playing. Dove brothers and sisters, everything done in faith multiplies in God's abundance. Use the Super Thanks feature to donate $100 today and join this sacred mission. When your roots are grounded in Him, your fruit will flourish, and your offering becomes a seed that bears blessed harvests. You kept developing at a rate that left them always behind, constantly attempting to evaluate the you of yesterday as you ventured into new spheres of personal mastery. They were studying shadows while you worked in dimensions they couldn't reach, and each time they believed they had figured out your current stage of development, you had already surpassed it. Not because it was passive, but because it was very active. Your silence became your most destructive weapon. You were deciding not to join in their drama, not to fall to their frequency, and not to interact with their lower energy. This was a calculated act of disengagement by someone who had finally realized their own worth and refused to lower it to fit the constraints of others. It was not avoidance motivated by fear. Instead of thunder and lightning, the moment of discovery arrived with the silent destruction of an unavoidable reality. You had never been the unsuspecting spectator they had pictured. Instead, you had been the scientist examining specimens who were too preoccupied to be aware that they were being studied. The realization struck them like a physical blow. Your mental archives recorded every word they said in your presence, believing you to be too unimportant to matter. Every tactic they used, thinking you were too simple to comprehend their games, had been examined and recorded for future use. The exquisite irony emerged. You had been teaching a master class in human psychology, using them as unwitting subjects, while they were busy attempting to control you. They were careless because they were arrogant, and they were transparent because they were careless. They disclosed their innermost anxieties, their basic insecurities, and their basic control mechanisms, all while thinking they were speaking to someone who was too weak to make good use of that knowledge. The extent of their error in judgment was astounding in its entirety. They hadn't realized how thoroughly you were dismantling their entire operating structure because they had been too preoccupied with preserving their superiority complex. You cataloged every manipulation technique they used. You examined each emotional trigger they tried to set off. You saw predictable patterns of behavior and examined each power play they performed with the dispassionate interest of a scientist. You started to see how tragically limited their strategy was. They could only function via force, control, and artificial elevation. They have no means to feel important without someone to devalue. They had no means of feeling important without drama to provide. They have no means of feeling strong without conflict to create. However, the way they interpreted your metamorphosis was possibly the most illuminating feature of their psyche. They saw it as a threat that needed to be eliminated rather than as proof that your innate strength was finally manifesting itself. It was important to control your growth rather than to praise it. Your awakening challenged their supposed hierarchy rather than inspiring them to grow. Everything you needed to know about their character was revealed in this response. Since they realized that power multiplied is power shared, people of true strength rejoice in the accomplishments of others. However, those with a scarcity mentality see every other person's success as a setback for themselves, every act of genuine confidence as a challenge to their manufactured superiority. The poverty of their inner life was revealed by their incapacity to truly be delighted for your growth. They lived in a world with limited resources, where they were less illuminated by the light of others, and where winning inevitably meant losing. The underlying flaw that had always motivated their actions was exposed by this zero-sum mentality. They sincerely thought that the only way to prove their value was to compare themselves to others and to be superior. Meanwhile, you had found something far more potent, the understanding that genuine value is intrinsic rather than relative. Your worth was independent of the devaluation of others. Someone else's weakness wasn't necessary for your strength. Darkness wasn't necessary to characterize your light. They now found themselves in the unachievable situation of knowing they had provided their alleged adversary with thorough intelligence about their vulnerabilities, while essentially being unaware of your actual capabilities. While they were preoccupied with their own display of superiority, the power dynamic had not changed gradually. Rather, it had entirely reversed. As they realized the full extent of their miscalculation, the paranoia grew. What more had you noticed that they were unaware of? When they thought you were too innocent to spot manipulation when it was taking place in front of you, what other tactics had you examined? Their mental energy was increasingly devoured by the questions, which increased exponentially and created a feedback loop of dread. They began questioning exchanges from months or even years prior, wondering whether what they perceived as triumphs had actually been setbacks they were too conceited to acknowledge at the time. When they believed they were teaching you, had you been making fun of them? When they thought they were proving themselves, were you studying their methods? The uncertainty was frustrating because it held the awful prospect that you had always been a few steps ahead of them while letting them keep up the appearance of being in charge. Nothing could have been more unsettling than your prolonged quiet. They could have dealt with the anger. It would have validated their story about your emotional instability and your incapacity to interact with them on their level. Providing defensive justifications would have fueled their sense of intellectual superiority. However, they had no familiar footing to stand on because of your calm distance, your seeming immunity to their provocations, and your refusal to play the games they wanted you to play. Your silence had a catastrophic psychological impact that they were unable to express but could sense. Silence was considered a sign of fear, submission, or defeat in their world. Their entire dominant strategy was based on evoking responses that would provide them with material, such as defensive reactions that they could manipulate into admissions of guilt, angry retorts that they could use to portray you as irrational, or emotional outbursts that they could use as proof of instability. However, none of these things applied to your quiet, because they had nothing to mistrust. It was the silence of someone who had nothing to prove. It was the quiet of total self-possession, of someone so sure of their own reality that they no longer needed confirmation from others. It was the quiet of a teacher observing pupils strain under lessons they had long since mastered. Silence like this left a void that started to rip at the very fabric of their world. They found themselves famished for the precise nourishment that their egos needed to sustain their artificial inflating, since they had no reactions to feed on, no emotional energy to vampirize, and no insecurity to take advantage of. Unaware that they had been emotional parasites, their host had now developed an immunity to their feeding strategies. It became increasingly clear that they required your reaction more than you needed to provide one, as they intensified their efforts to undermine your poise. They were addicted to the power they experienced when they were able to control the emotions of others, and you had cut off their supply entirely, as seen by their growing desperation. Their own emptiness was mirrored back to them by your stillness, which turned into a mirror. Without your involvement in their play, they were compelled to face the meaninglessness of their own lives, the flimsiness of their relationships, and the futility of triumphs won at the expense of others. They had to sit with their own energy instead of yours to absorb, and it wasn't nice. Glowing star yearning to witness God's miracles firsthand? Plant your spiritual seed now by contributing $100 or more through the YouTube Super Thanks button. Your offering lights the path for others and echoes through His divine plan, bringing His light into every step you take. The irony was delicious. They had exposed their own insolvency in an attempt to crush your soul. They had shown their own enslavement to patterns of conduct that did not satisfy them in any real way by trying to subjugate you. By attempting to demonstrate their superiority, They had revealed the deep insufficiency that motivated all of their behavior. They started overcompensating, putting more effort into games you had stopped playing, waging wars you had already conquered, and trying harder to elicit answers that never materialized. Their escalation merely served to emphasize your development, drawing attention to the starker difference between your progress and their stagnation. You had risen above the whole structure that had characterized your interactions, while others were still stuck in outdated habits. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all was that you might have been playing a whole different game all along. Everything they believed they knew about the situation needed to be completely reevaluated if your quiet presence had been active observation rather than passive participation, if your seeming naivete had been calculated intelligence gathering, or if your apparent submission had been strategic patience. They had realized that you fully understood them, which was even more upsetting than the fact that they had misinterpreted you. While they were essentially ignorant of your inner geography, you had scientifically surveyed their psychological topography. They were naked in a room full of blind people, only to find that the person they believed to be the most blind had been watching with perfect clarity the entire time. Your shift from viewed victim to exposed strategist wasn't merely a personal development. Rather, it was a fundamental reorganization of reality that left them trying to make sense of a world in which their presumptions were no longer valid. The most perceptive one had been the quiet one. The active intelligence had been the passive participant. The person whose attention was most important had been the one they believed they could ignore. They now confront the ultimate checkmate in this moment of recognition. The insight that the person they never regarded seriously enough to acknowledge as a master player had actually planned every move they made to keep their position of superiority. Your patience was the ultimate power move, not a sign of weakness. Your decision to remain silent was the most calculated one you could have made. It wasn't capitulation. Your observation wasn't passive. Rather, it was the most active method for someone with the intelligence to realize that sometimes the best strategy to win is to never seem to be playing at all. Their enlightenment, not their destruction, is what makes your victory so beautiful. To raise yourself, you never had to denigrate them. To preserve their fictitious elevation, you just had to cease letting them devalue you. The entire structure fell apart when you stopped participating in their hierarchy, not because you fought it, but because it was never as strong as they thought it was. They used your perceived weakness as the basis for their sense of superiority, and when you asserted your true power and took away that base, their whole structure collapsed. You didn't have to battle them. All you had to do was quit sustaining the delusion that gave the appearance of their supremacy. Now, possibly for the first time, they can see you clearly as they stand in the wreckage of their presumptions. Never was the mouse a mouse. The person with the best vision was always the observer. The most vital intelligence was being gathered by the quiet one. Furthermore, the conditions of engagement had been established from the start by the person they believed they could manage. The simple, devastating act of exposing that you had never been playing the game they believed you were playing, and that the game you were actually playing had already been won long before they realized it had begun, was how you delivered your checkmate. Not through confrontation or aggression. Ultimately, they discovered the most difficult lesson of all. Genuine authority does not require public announcement, defense, or proof. It only exists, observes, comprehends, and at the appropriate moment, makes visible what was always true but momentarily concealed. The mouse in the corner was never you. You were the maze's master at all times, silently laughing as others hurried down passageways that led to the very spot you knew they would, the moment when they would finally realize you were who you had always been. Checkmate selected. Before the game had started, it was yours.